I think the appeal of the Darksiders franchise lies in its ability to blend different genres together without feeling like a complete, incoherent disaster. However, as much as I love this series for that very reason, I think I made it clear in my 80-minute analysis of the first game that this blend of design principles is not perfect. Darksiders 3 is possibly my favorite in the franchise from a gameplay standpoint, but it not only has its fair share of flaws just as its predecessors have, but also the worst execution of certain elements compared to the other games. Part of me wants to analyze this series to defend and express my love for it, but another part of me wants to thoroughly study and examine these games in the vain hope that others can learn from these mistakes, make improvements, and iterate upon the good qualities. After all, despite being a blend of existing genres and ideas, each of these games feels wholly unique. This is also to their detriment, as Vigil Studios set the precedent that each game would play differently from one another, and Gunfire Games has continued with that tradition. There has been no iteration upon what each title has specifically done, and as no one has made a game similar, it feels as if each entry possesses unreached potential. So even though my efforts are likely to be in vain, I'd like to express why I love Darksiders 3 while acknowledging its room for growth. You can expect the usual gameplay and narrative spoilers here, so be warned if you'd like to play the game clean for yourself first. If you had to describe the combat for Darksiders 3 in one sentence, Bayonetta meets Dark Souls might be your best summary. An oversimplification, of course, and one that would set expectations, but it illustrates the most clearly understood attributes to its design. Fury and all of her foes are quick-moving like in Bayonetta or other character action titles. Like Bayonetta, there is an emphasis on dodging, and if you time your dodge perfectly, then everything slows down, allowing the player an opportunity to counterattack. Also like Bayonetta, there is an assortment of combos the player can utilize in combat. Unfortunately, because this game is inspired by Dark Souls as well, each action also comes with a commitment in which you cannot interrupt your attack or your item restoration. The player has a far more restrictive window in which to explore these combos than a traditional character action title. Which isn't to say you can take advantage of combos, it's more that there's a handful of them that are situationally useful, and are the best to utilize in those situations. On screen, you are seeing perhaps the most obviously broken combo. So long as you are facing a mid-size opponent one-on-one, it is possible to get them stuck in this combo juggle. Darkened foes with red glowing eyes, marking them as being more powerful than your average foe, can still be dispatched quite easily this way. All you need is an opening, one which often presents itself should you dodge your opponent's first strike. The only opponents this combo won't work on are those large enough to have poise, too big to launch into the air or break the poise of, and those capable of blocking, at least not without waiting for an opening. While there are more efficient methods of dealing with blockers that I'll detail later on, it is worth noting that these opponents require no greater tactic than waiting to dodge, countering, then starting to juggle while they're vulnerable. The combo is only good in one-on-one situations though, as a group of foes can easily stun lock the player. Mob etiquette is a curious thing in Darksiders 3, where fighting multiple large enemies at once is often less difficult than handling groups of smaller foes. Based on my observations, I believe this is due to when an enemy's attack begins in regards to animation and computer code. With larger foes, attacks take more time to execute, and so the player has more time to respond to each attack. The smaller foes, however, their attacks take far less time and are often far quicker, and thus it seems that their attacks often overlap. You may effectively avoid one strike, but you may not have the time to avoid the second enemy's attack. This is a problem, as the enemy attacks do not take into account Fury's recovery time. Perhaps the developers were afraid that the game would become too easy if the enemy attacks came in too far apart, but this means the player can get stun locked into oblivion themselves. This is especially true early on, where the player will have no choice but to fight multiple enemies at once. As such, the infinite combo juggle is best reserved for fighting enemies one-on-one, especially if you can kite them. For groups, the player has a simple whip combo that whirls around Fury and can be executed by simply holding the attack button down, but it's still full of openings and becomes less effective the stronger those surrounding opponents become. As such, Wrath and Havoc are your most capable options for taking on groups of foes, especially early on. The player has two separate gauges that charge as they inflict damage upon their foes. Wrath, the bottom bar that governs arcane attacks, and a spiraling Havoc bar, which allows Fury to transform into her Devil Trigger, or whatever you'd like to call it. Wrath charges far faster, and Fury's default arcane attack deals great damage to foes immediately surrounding her. It is great for making quick work of weaker foes in such a situation. Havoc just, well, there are technically combos to Havoc form, but it really is just a button mash mode. I believe that taking hits reduces Havoc's duration, but dodging and movement is so slow that you'd be losing duration anyway. Best to just button mash and deal as much damage as possible in what time you have available. Health also restores in this mode, so it can make for a last-ditch effort to clear enemies, restore health, and earn yourself a breather. When faced with groups, it is best to avoid locking onto your enemy so that you can swiftly change your target as quickly and specifically as possible. Unfortunately, the field of view leaves much to be desired, as enemies can lunge quite the distance for a melee strike, which means most incoming attacks will be from off-screen. Even the PC version has no option to increase field of view, and the camera just feels too close for those moments when you're facing a mob. It's far more suited to one-on-one combat when you're locked on. Earlier, I made mention of Dark Souls style commitment in the game's combat, and that manifests in two ways. The first is that, upon using an item, Fury will stop all she's doing to casually crack a crystal. It's very brief, but in a game as fast-paced as Darksiders, it is possible to get hurt while trying to heal or buff Fury. In addition, there is no dodge cancel, and each attack is a commitment. For those unfamiliar, dodge cancel means you can dodge even in the middle of an attack animation. Many fast-paced action games allow for this, including the original Darksiders, which also had a block cancel. Darksiders 3 does not allow for this, by default. Shortly after launch, Gunfire Games provided a patch to Darksiders 3 that allowed players to choose default controls or classic. Should you choose classic, then item usage will become instant and the player will be able to dodge cancel, to dodge even in the middle of an attack. Admittedly, I never played in classic mode until my third playthrough for this recording, and by then my muscle memory was so attuned to the default that I still timed many of my attacks and dodges as if I had no dodge cancel. However, there were some moments that I was able to take advantage of the feature, and it will make the game somewhat easier, but I don't think it would be enough to make that much of a difference. Just because you can more freely dodge doesn't mean you can frequently perfect dodge. You would still need to study enemy attacks to make sure you get the timing for the perfect dodge right, and those groups remain lethal so you can still miss your timing for a perfect dodge in a group. Additionally, in order to make item usage instant, there is no longer any animation associated with its usage. There's a sound cue and visual shimmer to indicate an item was used, but this can easily be missed in the hectic pace of battle. Fortunately, unless you're using the Nephilim's Respite, this game's version of an Estus flask, there's a cooldown for item usage, preventing you from accidentally using a second in case you missed the cues. This is a shared cooldown, however, which prevents a player from popping multiple buffs before a boss or a fight. While these are just the basics of combat, they will also be the first introduction to the game players will get, and as such they'll set expectations. Once a player sees the game behaves like Bayonetta, they'll begin comparing how it feels and responds to Bayonetta. Dark Souls fans are notorious for griping about any deviation from the From Software formulas, even within From Software's own games. It is for this reason that genre mashups are always difficult, because players will always mentally compare to games that specialize in just one style of gameplay without consideration of the other styles mixed in. Which is why I insist that the Darksiders games ought to be met on their own terms. Sticking to just the basics, Darksiders 3 is overly simple compared to its inspirations and even somewhat contradictory to itself. But we're not sticking to just the basics. As Fury progresses through her journey, she is gifted with 4 separate elemental weapons called Hollows. In addition to providing unique attack combinations, they also possess their own separate navigational abilities and, most significantly, arcane wrath attacks. Fury also becomes gifted with a projectile weapon called Salvation, which allows for enemy kiting and, well, it's a lot more boring than the combo juggle, but yes, you can cheese certain enemies with Salvation. With these weapons, Fury's combat possibilities are expanded. For example, in those situations where Fury is surrounded by enemies, the player may want to use the Force Hollow's Wrath ability to pull foes in and deal great damage. The perfect dodge counter similarly slams the hammer to the ground and sends hostiles flying. It is probably the best weapon to use in conjunction with your whip when you're fending off a group. If that weren't enough, the hammer is also capable of breaking the poise of foes who block. Even the bulky trumpeters in Wrath's territory can be knocked back with a hammer, opening them up to other attacks. This is the superior strategy over waiting to use the juggle combo, as the player can just swing the hammer, hit a few times with the whip, then swing the hammer again and start over. It may well be the most useful of the different weapons Fury can get, mitigated only by its slow speed and lack of combos. The flame daggers are the fastest weapon Fury wields, requiring the least commitment to attacks and therefore allows for better dodge reaction time. Similarly, the whip and flame daggers seem to combo together the best, with whip strikes leading into a swirling dagger toss, and the arcane counter of the combustible lunge easily being followed up by a whip strike. The combinations aren't too long or fancy, but it allows more offensive possibilities to the player. In addition, the arcane counter ignites enemies, causing continuous burn damage. Fury's Wrath with this weapon similarly immolates all who come near. The daggers themselves are better suited to one-on-one battles, but being the first hollow the player is granted, the Wrath ability grants the player a defensive option for handling crowds, even if it's not the best. The Storm Hollow's arcane counter is best suited to ranged opponents, so long as they aren't elevated too high. No matter how far the enemy attacks from, Fury's Storm counter will hit. Similarly, if the player is up against a powerful opponent, then the Storm Hollow's arcane Wrath attack will follow the enemy and deal constant damage. Unfortunately, the lance itself is inferior to the whip, daggers, and hammer, or at least has no benefit that outweighs what the others offer. It's not as quick as the daggers, it doesn't have the reach of the whip, and it doesn't hit as hard as the hammer. The Stasis Hollow I found is unfortunately the least useful of the different weapons. It is able to slow enemies with its arcane counter and Wrath ability, but the slowdown does not last long enough to properly capitalize on. The weapon isn't bad, but it's slower than the lance and daggers, slower than the whip without the reach, and lacks the poise breaking advantage of the hammer as well. Of course, the Stasis Hollow is often positioned to be the last weapon obtained, and therefore the player doesn't have the same amount of playtime to familiarize themselves with its moveset. However, I found it to be the least useful in combat despite its use in navigating the world. If I have any complaint with the implementation of these abilities, it is that the player has no real quick method of swapping between them mid-combo. You can blend attack combinations together between the whip and currently equipped Hollow, but if you'd like to try to go from, say, the Force Hollow to the Flame Hollow mid-combo, the game doesn't really allow for it. At the very least, though, you can swap Hollows and instantly counter during a perfect dodge. You aren't committed to a counterattack with your currently equipped Hollow, able to swap to your ideal counter for that moment instead. That should take care of the intricacies of combat, but there are still other ways to capitalize on the different Hollows Fury can obtain and how the player can approach combat. Much like Dark Souls, the player will earn souls from defeating foes and crushing consumable treasures with which they can use as experience points or currency. However, there's only a streamlined 3 stats used to level up: health, physical damage, and arcane damage. Most of your regular attacks will rely on physical damage, but your Wrath, Havoc, and Perfect Dodge counters all utilize arcane damage. You can spread your levels across these different stats to try and specialize in one type of damage over another, but it doesn't really behoove you to do so. Even if you were to do that, then the most useful stat to specialize in would be arcane, though that would depend on other customization choices available. However, you may wish to use some of that currency not just on restorative items or buffs, but on upgrade materials. There are several levels of adamantine necessary for upgrading your different weapons, and on later playthroughs, high-ranking foes will drop Oblivion ore that can be used to upgrade your different armor. As an aside, make sure you never defeat these guys with the power of gravity, because the treasure will forever be lost if you do. I feel like the economy of this weapon upgrade system does not mix so well with the combat design, in that there is a finite supply of upgrade materials to be found in the world, and purchasing adamantine can be expensive. Which, for a Souls-like, this is standard issue, even if the amount of souls gained in a Souls-like is often far greater than what is provided in Darksiders 3. The problem is that, as I outlined earlier, the different weapons are each intended to have different combat uses. While I did not personally find much purpose in the Stasis Blade compared to the others, that is in part due to the least familiarity due to receiving it last, and therefore having the least amount of upgrade materials to apply to it. In other words, no matter how much I wanted to try it, the Stasis Blade would always be weaker than the others. This matter is exponentially increased when the DLC weapon variants are introduced. Intended to swap out your current hollow weapon of equivalent element, these 4 variants upgrade separately to their base weapon, and there's no reasonable way to find or afford enough adamantine without some obnoxious grinding. As I said, the game is pretty sparse with souls compared to its contemporaries. So while you can just stick with the weapons you like, much as a Souls player may do, you are also losing out on combat possibilities due to how much the game structures its own economy. Perhaps if fewer resources were required to upgrade each weapon, the adamantine cost less to purchase, or souls became more plentiful, then the player would be able to more evenly level their equipment. As it is, the system works against itself by discouraging the player to capitalize on all of Fury's tools. At least your less upgraded weapons will still have value as enhancement activators. Enhancements are the real source of customization in Darksiders 3, as each contains unique active or passive benefits. For example, some passive benefits include an increase to maximum health, a boost to the amount of wrath generated per minute, or an increase to the duration of the Havoc form. Some active benefits include the restoration of health based on damage dealt with the weapon equipping that enhancement, souls obtained from wrecked objects in the environment with that weapon, or an increase to Havoc gain per attack with that weapon. In other words, the active benefit is only applied when the weapon is actively being used, while the passive benefit is active so long as the enhancement is socketed to a weapon, period. So let's say you wanted to focus on increasing arcane damage over physical. You might equip nothing but enhancements that increase Wrath and Havoc generation, and perhaps one increasing arcane damage with a certain weapon or increasing the chance for an arcane critical. This would provide the player more opportunities to activate Havoc and Wrath, both of which deal arcane damage, while also increasing the odds for high arcane damage with regular attacks. Which weapon has which enhancement socketed could also influence combat decisions. I would frequently have health restoration attached to my Flame Hollows, encouraging me to use them against hard-hitting foes and bosses while playing defensively, utilizing perfect dodges to restore health. I later slotted Havoc generation to my Force Hollow, which encouraged me to use the hammer more often to try and generate more Havoc after using that form. These enhancements are perhaps the most rare and expensive things to upgrade, as they require either angelic or demonic artifacts. Which path you upgrade, be it active or passive, is determined by which kind of artifact you first use. Once you upgrade a path, you are locked in. So if you upgrade the first active attribute node, you cannot upgrade the first passive one. At least not until you've invested 12 total artifacts into the chosen path, at which point you will need to invest 12 of the alternate artifact and what's called an Essence of the Chosen into the 4th node. At that point, the enhancement is fully upgraded on both paths. So what's an Essence of a Chosen? It's a resource obtained by defeating a Chosen, an optional world boss that is typically tougher than your average enemy. Only one of these Chosen is located on the main path in Wrath's domain, which is typically a late game area. This means it is possible for a player to upgrade 4 enhancements in a single playthrough, should they obtain enough artifacts. Once again, these are an expensive resource that you'll never find enough of in the world, but can purchase at 2,000 souls a pop, and only 3 of each available after defeating each sin. The final resource, if you could call it that, are the human survivors scattered throughout the world. If you find enough humans and send them back to Haven where the Makers guard the remnants of humanity, then Ulthane, our good pal from the first game, will provide the player with Rider's Mercy. It offers a new buff for every 5 humans rescued, with the final buff provided after 20 are found. This includes boosts to souls earned from defeated enemies, increased wrath earned, increased health, and an increase to damage dealt. It's not exactly customization, but it's definitely a boost to the player as they continue to explore the ruins of post-apocalyptic Earth. Which, frankly, is the biggest reason I play this game. Darksiders 3 might very well have the best 3D Metroidvania world I've seen in a game. A potentially blasphemous perspective to have, I know, but I think part of the reason is due to where the technology has progressed since the early 2000s. A game like Metroid Prime needed to have elevators separating different sectors to ensure a proper load time of the next zone's map and texture data. The interconnected nature of the world was illusory, each region segmented into its own isolated territory. Darksiders 3, on the other hand, is able to tie each of these sectors together more organically, connected not by elevators but caverns and passageways, creating a far more seamless world. Naturally, each region serves as its own biome with a distinct visual identity. The overgrown urban apocalypse, the web-infested subway caverns, the swampus shipyard filled with undead, the aquatic underground, and the inexplicable hell fortress built upon rivers of magma, all topped off with the desert wasteland of the Scar. Many of these environments are stacked on top of or beside one another, revealing signs of encroachment between the biomes. You can bear witness to how intricately designed and connected the world is from the very start. While walking a massive branch towards Haven at the very beginning, you can see a church down below. Directly beneath is the road the player must travel from the base of Haven's Great Tree to the church. Naturally, you'll be able to see Haven from below on that road, or from the church itself. Simultaneously, you can look down a crevice and into a subterranean pathway you'll access from beneath the church. The destination of this underground pathway is the shipyard that can be seen from the nearby cliffs. However, this route also shares a hidden pathway that connects to Gluttony's aquatic caverns, connecting a hub of shortcuts together. The more times I run through the game, the more I create a three-dimensional mental map of its environments, and the greater I am awed at the careful and intentional craftsmanship of its interconnected creation. I genuinely believe that anyone making a three-dimensional Metroidvania ought to play Darksiders 3 multiple times, studying it, taking notes, and finding inspiration. I reiterate, this is, in my opinion, the best 3D Metroidvania map in the industry today. Part of what makes exploration in this world work so well, however, is a curious deviation from the typical Soulsborne formula. Enemies only respawn when you die. Leveling up at Vulgrim, enemies stay dead. Using the serpent holes to teleport, enemies still remain dead. So long as you remain alive, then the enemies in the environment will stay dead. The only possible detriment is an inability to grind souls by felling foes, but in truth, monsters and enemies are the least source of souls in the game. Grinding enemies isn't going to benefit you much, not in the base game at least. This makes backtracking and exploration a lot more enjoyable, as the player doesn't have to worry about running past enemies or fighting them off. Note that enemies in this game do have long leashes, and as a result aren't always easily outrun. Darksiders 3 was designed for fighting, but this is less of a problem if the enemies you defeat stay dead, freeing you up to go back and explore areas so long as you survive, so that you can use new tools and uncover new pathways without having to deal with enemies. Now, in Wrath's region, there are two potential environmental hazards that could kill you and reset your status. The Whirling Stone Crushers, which are easily passed, well, so long as you run across them rather than overthinking the obstacle and trying to jump on blocks, and the Tumultuous Whirlwind crossing some surfaces. This one eats at me, because the timing can be so precise that you might die through minimal fault of your own. It's not a skill issue, it's a timing issue, and it would have been preferable if they implemented the same loss of health consequence you suffer when falling from a great height. As it is, should you screw up, you will die, and all enemies throughout the game world will respawn. However, the Scar, Wrath's territory, is also intended to be the last area you visit. Unlike the other regions, it only has the one access point and requires little in the way of backtracking. It is the most standalone, and therefore the easiest to obtain all collectibles on a single pass. As such, death here is only a consequence if you have failed to thoroughly explore the rest of the world map. Of course, that's assuming you explore in the intended sequence. Based on the game's writing and the value of the treasures found in those regions, the intended order for the player to progress are the magma-infested hollows first, which leads to Avarice's museum and Avarice himself. Once Avarice is defeated and the player obtains the Storm Hollow, they are guided back to the spider-infested subway system where they can conquer Sloth. The player should now be strong enough to take on the harder-hitting foes blocking the way to Pride, who task the player with defeating all other sins first. As such, the next destination is the Shipyard, home of the ranged weapon Salvation, the Sin Lust, and the Force Hollow. Now equipped with the power of gravity, the player can plunge into the depths and face Gluttony, rewarded with a Stasis Hollow last. The player can then access the Scar where they face Wrath, and once he is defeated, the player is finally able to take on Pride. However, Darksiders 3 also allows a degree of freedom in the order you can tackle the different sins. On my third playthrough, I decided to take the Flame Hollows and go after Lust first, then Gluttony, and then Wrath, meaning it is possible to do the harder sins first and leave Avarice and Sloth, the comparatively easiest, for last. There are limitations to this freedom, as Gluttony is inaccessible without first defeating Lust, and you cannot access Wrath without the Force and Stasis Hollows, which are gained by defeating Lust and Gluttony respectively. This means the freedom of choice is limited to only 3 sins at once: Avarice, Sloth, and whichever of the other 3 sins remain between Lust, Gluttony, or Wrath. You cannot, for example, have defeated Avarice, Sloth, and Wrath, and be free to choose between Lust or Gluttony. Even so, there are benefits to going out of order, especially since Lust's territory also contains the ranged weapon Salvation. Once you have the Force Hollow, you can actually take a shortcut within the subways, skipping most of the region and jumping right to Sloth. The player can also bypass Avarice's museum and cut right to the boss fight, though it's not really much of a time saver since you have to progress through the far more substantial hollows anyway, which is the only recommendation I would have for the world design of Darksiders 3. This open-ended approach does make it more replayable, which is valuable since the game has a New Game Plus mode referred to as Armageddon mode. However, there aren't many benefits to going out of sequence, save one substantial shortcut, one minor shortcut, and getting salvation early. The shipyard, the depths, and the scar are lacking any such shortcut as they must be played in a specific sequence, and as such there is little reason to take advantage of the game's open-ended design before getting salvation early or having to do less backtracking in the hollows or Splintered Station. Upon completing your first run through Darksiders 3, you will immediately be asked if you'd like to start an Armageddon run, and which base difficulty you'd like to choose. I find Apocalyptic to be a good balance for New Game Plus, with challenging to be fine for a first run. I've yet to play the highest difficulty, so I don't know how much more challenging it is, but regardless of what you choose, all of the enemy's base attributes are amplified, and some adjustments to the AI and behavior are made as well. The first notable difference is that high-ranking foes, noted by their charcoal black appearance and glowing red eyes, will drop Oblivion Ore, the currency necessary for upgrading armor. They will also appear more often, replacing standard enemies in certain locations. The most significant difference is the appearance of sudden, powerful enemies that drop Wisdom Shards, a consumable that increases the amount of souls gained upon defeating enemies for a temporary amount of time. These guys hit hard and are best dispatched with a Havoc form. At least I myself would save Havoc and Armageddon for these guys specifically, due to how aggressive and hard-hitting they tend to be. Perhaps the greatest benefit to the New Game Plus Armageddon mode is that, even if you do not currently have a weapon on your person, this socketed enhancement will still apply. The only exception seems to be Salvation, which needs to have its enhancement re-socketed once it is obtained. If you are interested in Metroidvanias, or in developing a Metroidvania of your own, then it would greatly benefit you to play and study the design of Darksiders 3's world. It is incredible, it is memorable, and oh yeah, it doesn't have a world map either. Yes, just like Dark Souls, but with the exception of the subway, I'm not sure there's a single part of this game, on any playthrough, I found myself lost. With so many landmarks, unique locations, and clearly defined biomes, it was easy to create the mental map in my mind. Now, I've discussed combat and I've discussed the world. I suppose it's time to discuss the primary objective in this game. At first I was going to describe each of these bosses and their attack patterns in detail, but the more I wrote and the more I thought about it, I realized it didn't illustrate why these boss fights are fine. They're okay, but they're nothing noteworthy either. In fact, some of them are the least memorable part of the game. What's more, some of the optional chosen scattered throughout the world, or bosses found in the DLC, are far more memorable and engaging to fight despite mostly being leveled up versions of already existing world enemies. So instead, I want to look at 3 separate bosses in closer examination: Avarice, Gluttony, and Wrath. Avarice most easily represents what Gunfire Games is trying to go for. He relies on attack patterns and phases, and partway through the first fight, those patterns will change. This is not unlike many bosses found in the Souls-like series, where they'll have multiple phases where their attacks will change and the difficulty will increase. For Avarice, he will first hop onto his horde piles, chucking junk before leaping down onto the player. The player cannot counter these projectiles with the Storm Hollow as he leaps too fast, but I also admit I never thought to try using Salvation in this phase. Even if I had, though, Avarice is supposed to be a first boss and early boss, so the expectation is that the player is purely on the defensive during this time anyway since they won't have Salvation. This is the first problem with these bosses. While the player can be as proactive or defensive as they wish out in the world, there is far less creative combat freedom when tackling the sins. When Avarice is on top of the piles, you're supposed to be defensive. It's traditional, old-fashioned even, phase-based boss design. Once Avarice drops down, he begins the fight with swift kicks, each with very little wind-up. However, once Avarice has taken enough damage, he'll start wielding furniture instead, causing the player's learned reaction time to become obsolete as the attack pattern has changed. This is certainly imitating the Dark Souls style logic that, as the fight goes on, the enemy develops new attacks that become more aggressive. The problem is that the earlier phases should have the easier attacks to telegraph and learn. Avarice's latter attacks hit harder, but once you've learned them, they're actually easier to spot, time, and dodge than its earliest attacks. Avarice isn't a bad boss, but is certainly representative of the clashing ideals here. There's an understanding of what makes Souls-like bosses enjoyable, but then they're mixed together with boss design concepts that belong in a Zelda game more than a character action or Souls-like. Avarice, as a boss, has moments where the player is forced into a defensive position before they can just fight the boss. Gluttony, on the other hand, is all about defensive phases. The player can only run in circles as he spits stomach acid across the arena. The player must go into one of the corners after to avoid the 360 swing around a chamber, impossible to evade with a dodge or jump. The player will need to use the Force Hollow to avoid being sucked into Gluttony's vacuous maw, even though it seems like he has some degree of resistance to the Force Hollow power. Each of these decisions inhibit player freedom and opportunity for aggression, and they also prolong the battle unnecessarily. You can tell Gluttony was given more health because the second phase is all just a gimmick, but as there are far fewer and far smaller windows to deal damage, this just drags the fight out unnecessarily. As for that second phase, just deactivate the Force Hollow to lure the deep sea mines in front of Gluttony, then reactivate it to drop right to the ground as the mine is sucked into Gluttony's maw. Repeat and finish off with a God of War style execution. Wrath has a gimmicky first phase as well, where Fury jumps into the middle of an arena filled with combatants engaged in melee. You can deal as much damage to Wrath as you wish, but once he gets close to death, he'll begin to pound the ground, slaughtering all other fighters and drawing their souls in as health restoration. That second phase, though, it's just a melee. No defensive phase, nothing that forces the player to wait until the boss comes down to play fair, it's just a brawl. I could describe each individual attack, effective methods to dodge, so on and so forth, but when you're fighting Wrath, you're not thinking so particularly. Your brain is calculating like a high-speed processor, eyes studying his animations to know when to stop swinging and hit dodge, recalculating if your timing was off and you take damage and need to recover. It's just a fight. The closest boss to being similar is Sloth, who seems to have a blind spot on their side. It may be particular, as some of Sloth's swings seem to whiff overhead while others strike, but a perfect dodge can be timed regardless. Stick to Sloth's side and you can fight as aggressively as you desire, but it's also a bit too easy because of that blind spot. Lust will guard most of your attacks, forcing the player to only retaliate after a perfect counter or in brief punishment windows. Having Usiel hop in and join the fight on her side is clearly trying to replicate something like the Bell Gargoyles or the infamous Ornstein and Smough fight from Dark Souls, but the best strategy is to just hang back, wait for him to charge, and use the blue glint on his bell to signal when to dodge. If you wish to keep him alive, then prepare an immediate second dodge, then counter when Lust performs her follow-up attack. So long as you keep hanging back, they will continue attacking in this pattern. Defensive, repetitive, easy. Pride allows for a bit more aggression, but forces the player into particular attack phases due to the bubble shield. The statue head that beams lasers makes for an interesting enough obstacle, but not enough to really make the fight with Pride challenging. The last item I will note here involves the game's buffs. If you try to pop a Fortification, Strength, Arcane, or Thorn Shard before entering the boss arena, its duration of effectiveness will be ticking down even during the cutscene that plays before the fight. So it is better to wait until after the cutscene, or to simply skip the cutscene in order to capitalize on the buff's effectiveness. Due to the cooldown, you can't just activate buff after buff, but for most bosses, one Fortification Shard will reduce damage quite nicely, and one Arcade Shard will increase the effectiveness of Wrath, Havoc, and Arcane counters enough to take some gouges out of health bars. Though Gluttony still puts a twist on this, as you normally get to meet with Vulgrim before a boss. Instead for Gluttony, it just jumps right into the cutscene, and the player has no time to preemptively apply a buff. In regards to gameplay, I would honestly say the sins are the weakest part. It's a good thing they stuck to just the sins that exist instead of trying to match the number of bosses a From Software game might have. Darksiders 3 has two separate DLC you can optionally purchase. The base game can be enjoyed without either, which is how I've played it previously. Technically, should you play just the base game, nothing will feel missing. It's what the DLC brings to the table that has me questioning just what is or isn't missing in hindsight. The Void is effectively a set of 4 dungeons that are more puzzle focused than what you'd find in the base game. If you are missing the puzzle-focused design of the first 2 games, then the Void DLC is just the remedy you're looking for. Each dungeon is dedicated to one of the 4 elemental hollows Fury has obtained, though each subsequent dungeon will utilize each hollow obtained thus far. Keep in mind this assumes you'll be getting the hollows in order, so you cannot progress after the Flame Hollow dungeon until you've defeated either Avarice or Sloth and gotten the Storm Hollow. Most of the puzzles will involve crystal orbs responsive to each element, resulting in different modifications to the platforms in the immediate area. So, blocks will move once the orb is struck by a flame hollow, will obtain a magnetic effect when struck with the force hollow, will permit the frozen wall jump when struck with stasis, or will have a whirlwind appear up top when struck with a storm hollow. Each dungeon transforms in a unique way and, the further in you go, combines the different powers for more and more unique room puzzles to solve. There are also a variety of secrets that can be missed by the unobservant, and some obstacle courses relying on swiftly swapping hollows between leaps. The Void DLC is honestly a nice little distraction from the base game, padding its length out a bit while providing a bit of a fresh new experience due to being more platform and puzzle based. However, while the stone-based enemies are unique in appearance, all the foes within the DLC seem to be based on the rigging of an enemy in the base game. The only unique foes are the bosses, which are the same enemy fought 4 times, with new attacks added to each encounter. Once the 4 bosses are defeated, they combine into the final boss of the DLC, who is, perhaps, a better and more challenging fight than any of the sins proper. Unfortunately, he, too, only has a few attacks that are quick to learn, and while the final phase of his boss fight will mix these attacks up into longer, more complex combos, they're easy enough patterns to learn that he can be taken down with minimal attempts required. Nonetheless, he's the biggest and most interesting challenge of the whole game. Once all is said and done, the player is rewarded with the Abyssal Armor, which is arguably the best armor in the game. It's certainly stronger than any of the individual elemental hollow armors, and can even be rolled over into a clean save slot. Though my third playthrough was a brand new, clean save, I had access to the Abyssal Armor from the game's beginning. While you have to earn the armor by defeating the DLC, it still feels as if you are paying real-world cash for better gear, not just additional gameplay. You also obtain additional upgrade materials, though this is somewhat offset by also getting new enhancements and weapon variants with which to spend these resources on. On one hand, you now have more weapons to upgrade than you'll need, but each one can also have an enhancement slotted to it. This means you get an additional 4 passive benefits from enhancements, and these roll over into a New Game Plus. So while the additional weapons aren't themselves more pay to win, the ability to pretty much buy 4 additional enhancement slots kind of is. The Crucible, the other DLC available, is mostly just a horde mode. You face wave after wave of enemies to earn Crucible tokens and souls, and if you complete all 100 waves, including an individual run from start to finish in one go, then you can face off against Wicked K, another boss that is more interesting than any of the sins in the base game. I don't consider many of the awards in the Crucible as good as those in the Void, largely as the enhancements and armor are more specialized, but you can earn chunks of adamantine using the Crucible tokens, which are a very valuable upgrade material. Additionally, if you do want to grind some souls, then Crucible is the most efficient way to do so, especially if you save all those wisdom shards you get in New Game Plus from the tougher enemies that pop up. All players want DLC to be substantial, but there's always going to be a balance between what you can add without impacting the base game too heavily. It's not really pay to win, as it doesn't make the game that much easier, and you can certainly complete the base game without any of those DLC benefits, but a difference is still made. If you were to really twist my arm though, I would recommend grabbing Darksiders 3 as a bundle with the DLC, as the Void and the Crucible were both enjoyable additions for me. The Void is just good content experimenting with the mechanics and dungeons that would not have fit into the base game, and the Crucible allowed me to experiment with and better enjoy the combat. They aren't necessary, but I do feel like they enhance the experience of Darksiders 3. The writing of Darksiders 3 is in this weird state where it's not so bad the flaws are obvious, but it's also not good enough to be truly impactful. I think a lot of that has to do with Fury herself, despite Gunfire Games' efforts to craft a story whose sole purpose is to see her grow and overcome many of her flaws. Fury is an impatient, conceited, and inconsiderate personality with a distaste for authority. She is only interested in fighting and doesn't even seem to have a cause for which she fights, which begs the question of why she would betray her fellow Nephilim alongside her more honorable brothers, War and Death. All that aside though, the prior Darksiders games are all about the core horseman facing and overcoming challenges internal as much as external. With Fury, however, those external challenges are the 7 different sins that she must hunt down, intended to confront her with a reflection of her own sins in turn. The problem is that not all sins are created equal, and only a few seem to really make any kind of impact. Wrath is perhaps the best choice to bookend Fury's growth as written, as our introduction to her is, again, as impatient, conceited, and inconsiderate. However, in what is perhaps the first cutscene likely to actually get players sitting up and intrigued in the story, Wrath kind of sets the stage for how we should feel about our protagonist.
Rampage! Your master summons you! Run!
It's funny what you remember in between screams. My siblings used to refer to you as the dumb one. Yes! The harder you fight, the stronger I
I'll tear you apart!
Wrath as a character feels more like an angry Muppet screaming at the top of his lungs during a Gwar concert, but it is this moment that I first became invested in Fury's journey. She's a horseman. You can't be a horseman without a horse. While removing Rampage was clearly a mechanical decision to better fit the Metroidvania, Souls-like design they were going for, it still had implications for franchise fans. Additionally, Wrath referring to Fury as the Dumb One indicates that Fury is the least respected of her horseman siblings, and that any negative assessment of her character based on what we'd seen thus far is intentional. By the end, however, Fury will have changed.
Where is your anger? How can you fight without anger?
As I said, Wrath serves as a bookend for her character arc, but as we go through the other sins, it doesn't quite feel so clear or earned. If Avarice is fought first, there is no conflict. Fury feels no compulsion to collecting material things and looks down upon the hoard of mortal treasures he's built up. Sloth, on the other hand, almost lulls Fury into a slumber, one that feels forced and goes against one of her earliest lines.
Had I known the new pact would be so exciting, I would have let walls separate my head from my neck then and there. Is it possible to die of boredom?
Fury was bored senseless without a mission, so why would she give in to laziness and abandon her mission? Why would that even be a temptation? It's not that Fury is lazy, it's that her problem with authority prevents her from wanting to do anything for others. She is ambitious, however, and her whole purpose in this journey is so that she might earn a place as leader of the Horsemen. If she were the sort to give in to slothfulness, then she'd not even want to perform any duty of the Horsemen. Still, it is the rest of the dialogue that seems to really characterize Fury and, in a rare case of granting personality to the villains, Sloth.
Are you begging? Muster up a little dignity.
Sweetheart, I let slaves wipe my ass with the wings of angels while I enjoy a morning tea. Dignity is a myth, like the balance you fight for.
Fury isn't properly challenged until Lust, though only after some attempts at subverting expectations. I'm not surprised Gunfire would choose to avoid or change the concept of lust from being sexual in nature to the idea of lusting for anything, but the downside is it then makes lust redundant. You can have a lust for wealth, like avarice, and you can have a lust for food, as gluttony does. As far as the lust for power, as they illustrate within the dialogue, that should be Pride's territory. Everything Lust offers Fury is redundant with that which Pride offers, save that Pride escalates Fury's status from rolling her fellow horsemen to rolling the planet alongside her. Instead, Lust simply tries to appeal to Fury's desire for power, which is no different than her pride. Were I to try to subvert expectations, I'd swap the expectation of Lust being a woman for being a man, making them into a Dionysus-like hedonist that doubles as a chauvinist or something. Perhaps he could have led some of the female angels in Usiel's charge astray, and even managed to charm Usiel with promises of his own angelic harem or whatever. Regardless, it's not the sin or what they represent that is important in this scene. It's the continued observation that there's something suspicious of Fury's entire mission. An observation first made by the Lord of the Hollows. a mysterious figure offering angel and demon alike respite from their eternal war and acting as benefactor to Fury. He seeks to temper her rage and impetuousness and get her to consider the bigger picture, the part she has played and continues to play for the Council, and to perhaps reconsider her position. This, too, begins to encourage Fury to question things, but it's only now at the halfway point of the game that it has a lasting impact on the dialogue. In other words, rather than the character development being a slow change, it took 3 sins to die before Fury suddenly starts thinking that, hey, maybe there's something up, and maybe she's not that great a person after all. No doubt, however, this is the consequence of making avarice and gluttony optional. Fury has to remain the same character until she's defeated lust, but at the same time, if you defeat sloth and avarice last, she seems to have undone any and all character development. Moving on, gluttony unfortunately doesn't do much more than stoke Fury's anger by regurgitating the head of her beloved steed. Any further revelations are tied to the Lord of Hollows, who merely speaks ominously. Wrath, as stated, is the bookend. Fury is no longer fighting with rage, but is instead calm and collected. To reiterate, Fury was challenged but expressed no change until her fight with lust. Gluttony is the only sin that, sequentially speaking, comes between lust and wrath. However, gluttony directly provokes Fury to anger. There's no moment where Fury has to suppress her own anger and rage so that she can fight calmly instead. When Fury approaches pride, she's able to discard the offer to rule Earth alongside her, overcome her own personal pride, and do what must be done, but it doesn't really feel earned. Then envy shows up. So, with one caveat, envy is the one definitive redeeming quality of this whole game's narrative. Throughout the entire game, she is disguised as a Watcher, a servant of the Council that, if you played the first Darksiders, you'll know is untrustworthy. At first, the Watcher is practically a groveling presence doing nothing but praising Fury, all the while seeming to want to avoid conflict. Once Lust has been defeated, however, the Watcher begins to question Fury, be it in her role in the universe, her loyalty to the Council, or even snide remarks regarding Fury's development as a character. Though, perhaps for me, one of the best lines the Watcher offers is,
Perhaps. Or perhaps the universe holds much more mystery than I ever imagined.
What does that mean, mistress? I detest philosophy.
The reveal that the Watcher has been envy the whole time may come as a surprise, but not without some problems. The player is led to believe the tutorial boss, this Jim Henson's dark crystal creature, is envy. Now, there are a couple subtle hints when we first meet this bird that they're not envy. After this fight, the player obtains a talisman that will guide the player to the nearest sin on their compass, but in the cutscene before the battle, the eyes of the talisman are not glowing until in proximity to the Watcher. From that point on, the talisman never stops glowing. After defeating Not Envy, the Watcher seems a bit nervous when addressing the talisman's capabilities. However, Furious is oblivious to its curious behavior.
If I may, there is a sort of hum emanating from the talisman. That glow
Will indicate when one of the 7 is nearby. I know.
so wise. You are all that the Council promised, mistress.
I'm beginning to enjoy the sound of your voice, Watcher.
This is actually really good to set up the dynamic of Fury and Envy in disguise. Envy doesn't actually like Fury, and you can hear the sneer in her voice as it becomes clear Fury is oblivious to the telltale sign that his sin is right beside her. However, it only makes sense that the Watcher's behavior would change over time. As Fury overcomes her flaws and starts to become a better, stronger person, as she starts to change and grow, Envy gets irritable because Envy, by her very nature as the sin of jealousy, cannot improve as an individual. This is shown most in her choice of attire, where she sports facsimiles of the weapons of death, war, and strife, and the armor of fury. She's imitating the horsemen and even uses some of their attacks in the final battle, while simultaneously summoning her siblings to attack for her. Envy has no unique weapon or fighting style of her own, instead using everyone else's strengths to make up for her lack thereof. On top of that, after defeating Lust, they give a major hint toward this reveal.
And why would you do that?
What reason would I have to protect that sniveling coward? She has never experienced frontline combat. She has never experienced the horrors of war. She is the most pathetic of us. Get me to the edge of Haven, and what you want will be yours.
Now, the problem is, when I first played this game, I heard that line and didn't even notice where Lust was looking. Instead, I was thinking, didn't I already defeat Envy? In fact, who was this bird creature that Fury specifically referred to as Envy? According to a wiki, there were some rival character of Envy's that got their hands on the Talisman of Sin, but this is stated nowhere in the game itself. So when Lust says she's going to reveal the location of Envy in exchange for her life and freedom, it seemed odd to me that Fury didn't say she already defeated Envy. On repeat playthroughs, this continues to irritate me because it is an actual plot hole. Simultaneously, the game does make reference to the ability of the Sins to change their shape. Gluttony has commented on looking different than when Fury last saw him.
Was that one of the 7?
Perhaps. One could have changed since our last encounter.
So, theoretically, it shouldn't be surprising that Fury might not recognize who is or isn't Envy, but if that were the case, why would she immediately refer to the bird as Envy upon sight? I understand that even the first game is bound to have plot holes due to its conspiratorial plotline, but these aren't even the sort of, hey, wait a minute, plot holes you realize when thinking about it in the shower. These are immediate questions that can rip you right out of the moment, especially on a replay. Questions like these ruin a plot twist because it reveals how shaky the twist was in the first place. Once Envy is revealed to be the final big bad, Fury is served some humble pie and forced to accept she's been an awful person. However, it turns out this whole adventure was preparing her for a greater purpose, to guide the final remnants of humanity to a safe location where they can hide and she can protect them. Additionally, if you fought the optional boss Abraxas, oh yeah, there's an optional boss Abraxas that the Lord of Hollows mentions at the beginning of the game, and then goes unmentioned unless you stumble upon him in Wrath's territory, aka near the end of the game, and spare the Lord of Hollows, you'll get a magic MacGuffin that will surely factor into the next or final Darksiders game, should it ever happen.
Stop! Where did you get that? Deliver that unto us.
No. No. I don't think it was made for you. Besides, feels pretty good.
Honestly though, I don't feel it. It's funny that I used to think so little of the original Darksiders story, only to realize over the years how tight it was, how stylish it was, and how good, even if subtle, War's character development is. Death's character and arc was no doubt the best of the three, so it's quite a disappointment for Fury's journey to be so lackluster. One of the reasons I'll replay the other two games is for the story, the world, and the characters, but Darksiders 3, it's hardly a consideration. It's not like this is a franchise defined by its narrative, but it's been so imaginative that it really is a shame that Darksiders 3 was so much more lackluster in this department. It actually makes me wonder if I even want to see this story come to a close. The best way I can think to describe Darksiders 3, and perhaps the franchise as a whole, is through a glitch that occurs in the Swamplands. I've played this on PS4, Xbox consoles, and PC, and on each one these storage containers occasionally have a glitched texture that has gone unfixed. This is not what a storage container looks like. It is a gray box asset, and it really stands out against the rest of the art direction and visuals, for a while at least. After a time, you get used to it, even laugh at it, and enjoy the rest of the experience for what it is, a well put together piece of art. I will never try to convince someone that Darksiders 3 is a perfect game, or that it's one of the best games ever made. I only wish to explain what I think it does well, why it's one of my favorites, and hope that I can convince others it is worth a try. Perhaps, if you already tried and bounced off of it, I helped provide some insight that might make a second attempt worth it. Now, I suppose I really ought to get to Darksiders 2, though in some fashion or another, and probably Darksiders Genesis. Either way, thank you for watching, and for those of you that have been waiting, I am immensely grateful for your patience. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.